Millions of people have lost weight with personalized plans from Noom. Like Evan, who can't stand salads and still lost 50 pounds.
Salads generally for most people are the easy button, right? For me, that wasn't an option. I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. But Noom worked for me.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
Wow.
Nice.
Yeah.
What you're hearing are the sounds of people everywhere putting on Bombas socks, underwear, and T-shirts made from absurdly soft materials that feel like plush clouds. Yeah, that plush. And the best part? For every item you purchase, Bombas donates another to someone facing homelessness.
Bombas. Big comfort for everyone. Go to bombas.com/ACAST and use code ACAST for 20% off your first purchase. That's bombas.com/ACAST. Code ACAST.
I'm Sandra, and I'm just the professional your small business was looking for. But you didn't hire me because you didn't use LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn has professionals you can't find anywhere else, including those who aren't actively looking for a new job, but might be open to the perfect role, like me.
In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you'll miss out on great candidates like Sandra. Start hiring professionals like a professional. Post your free job on linkedin.com/spoken today.
Hello and welcome to The Napoleonicist. I'm going to start with a question today. You know that feeling that you sometimes get when you're in a room full of people and you just know that you're the least intelligent person in the room? That's me right now. For one very simple reason. I am joined by not one, not two, but three of the world's most highly regarded experts of the Napoleonic era. Why, I hear you say? Well, because we're going to right a wrong that's been preceded on this podcast up until now. We are going to look at the politics of this period, and specifically the politics of war. Joining me to discuss this are Professor Beatrice de Graaf, a Napoleonicist regular who is a distinguished professor of history of international relations at the University of Utrecht. She's the author of Fighting Terror After Napoleon, How Europe Became Secure After 1815. Also joining me is Professor Alex Mikaberidze. Alex is Professor of History and Ruth Herring Noel Endowed Chair for the Curatorship of the James Smith Noel Collection at Louisiana State University, Shreveport. Alex is the author of The Napoleonic Wars, A Global History, and a number of works on the Russian perspective of the Napoleonic Wars. And last but by no means least, we have Professor Charles Esdaile. Charles is Emeritus Professor of History at the University of Liverpool and author of, amongst a whole host of other books, Napoleon's Wars, The Peninsular War, A New History, and famously once described Napoleon as being like a squirrel. That is to say, he's a rat with great PR. It's brilliant to have all of you on. Beatrice, welcome back. Charles and Alex, welcome to the Napoleonicist for the first time. How are you all doing?
That was quite an introduction, Zach. I'm blushing here. I don't know if the video picks it up. That was overly generous, especially.
I aim to please. I aim to please. Charles, how are you doing?
I'm fine. I'm fine. To be fair, I did say he was an airborne rat with great publicity.
I apologize. I've misquoted you. Beatrice, how are you? It's good to see you again.
I'm totally flattered and honored to be invited here again on the Napoleonicist, and I do think that you're doing yourself not a great favor, because we're all in awe of you and your social media skills and everything. So very happy to be here.
See, I have a knack of being able to be very vocal with a very small amount of knowledge. So it's all kind of a smoke and mirrors scenario as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, let's get down to business, because there is a very obvious starting point for this discussion, isn't there? Clausewitz. War is a continuation of foreign policy by other means. Also, we're led to believe, anyway, there is sort of a separate discussion to be had about the precise translation. Should it actually be by other means rather than with other means? Because the word used is mit, which folks who are familiar with German will know is with rather than by. But either way, the fundamental point still stands, right? War is a continuation of foreign policy. So I will make my first question a very simple one. Is Clausewitz right? But then perhaps more interestingly, at what point do you think war stops becoming foreign policy and starts fundamentally becoming war? Beatrice, do you want to start us off?
Yes, this is really a fascinating discussion, and it has been waged before, hasn't it? I mean, when David Bell brought out his seminal work, The First Total War, in 2007, he argued that with Clausewitz, that the total war meant that war and foreign policy and domestic policy became blurred, that the revolutionary Napoleonic Wars, they presented this new notion of total mobilization of society. They blurred the boundaries between combatants and non-combatants, between the domestic and the foreign. And I really liked his argument, although there was some criticism, for example, Jeremy Black, who said, well, all modern warfare wasn't total, and ancient modern warfare was sometimes total as well. So there is a discussion here, although I do side more with David Bell, but I'm interested to hear how Charles and Alex see Bell's argument.
Alex, sorry, Charles, go for it.
Well, as far as David Bell is concerned, I wrote a very critical review of his book, which he did not like at all, and produced a very combative answer in French History Online or something. I can't remember what, H France Review or something. Anyway, and produced a very combative answer, which I refused to engage with. I found the book very selective in its arguments. What examples does he come up with? He comes up with the Vendée. He comes up with the Peninsular War. Those are fairly anomalous situations, and the Peninsular War is a lot more complicated than he makes out anyway. That said, whilst I believe that the phrase was war is a continuation of foreign policy with an admixture of other means, yes, I do take his point. Of course, you can say that as soon as you get total war, you have a situation in which foreign policy, international relations, war making, domestic policy, all become combined into a single whole. The only thing that I would argue is that I don't really think this happens in the Napoleonic period.
Why not, Charles? Before we move over to Alex, why would you suggest that?
Well, let's take France. I mean, France is the archetypal nation in arms. It's France, which gives us the idea. Let's look at the French nation in arms. Very quickly, under Napoleon, you don't see a nation in arms. You see a continent in arms. You see every possible measure being taken to ensure that France is not fighting a total war. Napoleon doesn't fight a total war, and when he's finally forced to in 1814, because he's been kicked out of the rest of Europe, the French won't back him. So I do have some difficulty with the notion. I think that what you get is the concept. Certainly you can argue that France in 1793-94 is either fighting a total war or at the very least on the road to fighting a total war. You can say that Spain in 1808 was aspiring to fight a total war, but actually failing miserably. I mean, the Spanish war effort is, for all the reasons I've laid out in my books, shambolic. No fault of the Spaniards. But I think the idea is there. But does it come together in the way it comes together in the First World War, or for that matter, the American Civil War? No, it doesn't.
And Alex, I noticed that you're nodding through much of what Charles has said there. Would you agree with that?
Yes. I think there is a distinction, I think, to be made between the rhetoric of the total war, which you see, especially during the revolutionary period, up to the start of Napoleonic Wars. There is a lot of rhetoric about fighting the totality of the war. And then the reality, as Charles pointed out, because the reality is that Napoleonic Wars, especially in the later halves, were not total wars. In fact, deliberately so. If nothing else, Charles already mentioned that in 1814, when Napoleon was indeed confronted with a choice of waging that total war during the invasion of France, he chose not to. And same applies during the Russian invasion in 1812. Both sides deliberately avoided fighting what we now would imagine as a total war. Napoleon, by not issuing the proclamation of emancipation of serfs, deliberately so, and on the Russian side, there were all efforts made not to actually encourage necessarily the peasant uprisings. In fact, I'm just finishing a new biography of Kutuzov, and you see there that Kutuzov uses the Russian military force to actually beat down the peasant unrest while he's fighting a war against Napoleon. Now he selectively encourages bands to fight Napoleon, but it's not part of this total war kind of effort. So I think I side more with Charles on this issue, that the concept indeed comes forward during the Revolutionary War. It's an important moment in that sense. The decree of Levée en masse creates that vision of a nation at war and mobilized for it. But then it dissipates for a while, and it will be only much later that we truly will see that the total war, the way we envision it, especially in having read both Charles's review of Bell's work and Jeremy Black's. You can see the antecedent to this in previous eras, right? What is the total war? As Beatrice mentioned, it's a fuzzy concept in that sense. How do you define the totality? Because one nation might be fighting what it perceives as a total war, but for the other nation, it can be actually a limited a military effort.
Yes, if I may jump into there, I really am fascinated by this discussion, because it depends so much on where you look and from which perspective you are assessing this. Because if you look at the German sources of the German lands that were occupied, and that the German peasants that were suffering, the citizens that were suffering in the sieges of the latest battles during the Napoleonic War, or for my part, the Netherlands, who were incorporated in France between 1810 and 1813, as soon as Napoleon issued that decree, he hauled all the ministers and the capable persons of the Netherlands to France and instructed them to transform the whole infrastructure of the country, the taxes, the economy, everything, in order to prepare for more war and to mobilize more recruits. So it's not just mass conscription, it's also mass enforcement, and it's also overturning of all the resources in the country for the war machinery. So in specific areas and places, it really played out as a total war, in the sense that the whole infrastructure of a country, society, was transformed in the direction of waging war. And there's another aspect which I did very much like in Bell's book. It's the way the war imprinted itself in the hearts and minds of the populaces. And I listened to the talk, Zach, you were there as well, I think, of deaf men talking about the Waterloo veterans, and how they described how war sort of immersed the whole society in the imagery, in the metaphors, and also traumatized so many people. There were so many invalids, so many veterans after that. And also, if you read the literature, the poems, the pamphlets in Germany, in the Dutch or the Belgian lands, it's all about the fear for a new war. So in that sense, it was more total. It affected more citizens, peasants in far remote corners of their countries than it did before. Of course, it's all gradual, of course. It's and I can see if you compare to 1918 or 1945, the age of industrialized warfare, it's different altogether. But the notion that there's no distinction between combatants and non-combatants, this infrastructure part of it and the trauma, I think, is important to stress.
I mean, as somebody who has very much worked on the Peninsular War in particular, from beneath. I mean, the latter half of my work on it has been very, very much about the popular experience of war, about popular mobilization, about popular responses to war, and indeed about the horrors of war. I hear everything that you say, Beatrice. The Napoleonic Wars was a pretty immersive experience. Depending where you were, of course. I mean, if you were on some family farm down in the Dordogne, I mean, it was obviously very different from if you're on a family farm somewhere in Poland. Obviously, things were different where you were. That, I don't think that the mere fact that war was becoming more all-embracing makes it a total war. I think that I would still stick with my concept was there, but not the reality. And the trouble is, I would also go back from where you are, in that if you take, let us say, the wars of the Spanish Succession a century before, or let alone the 30 Years' War, those wars were just as immersive, just as devastating. And if you look at the numbers of troops who Louis XIV mobilized, you know, in terms of the proportion of the French population, you're not far short of what Napoleon did. Equally, if you take another episode in which my more or less illustrious ancestors were mixed up in, if you take the 45, yes, I mean, I am descended from a Highlander who fought against Bonnie Prince Charlie. But you can draw a direct comparison between the horrors of the Vendée and the horrors that happened to the Highlands in 1746. I think that there is a greater continuum here than people imagine. And I do worry about this tendency to say the French Revolution and Napoleon changes everything. It's a step on the road.
So is what we're looking at here a greater availability of material that enables us to gain an insight into the experiences of the ordinary person? Or are we looking at a technological shift which allows a better distribution of information that therefore in turn gives us more insight, but also means that the public is better informed and therefore is more completely immersed? Or is there something else entirely?
You know, I wanted to make a point about the 30 Years' War, which Charles alluded to, because anyone who would have, lived through that experience would have certainly talked about the totality of the war, the sack of Magdeburg, let's say, right? The indiscriminate nature of the war. But how many accounts do we have coming from the war, from an average soldier, from an average citizen? I think that's one of the sides of the wars, that the Napoleonic War produced a profusion, really, I mean, a plethora of accounts on all sides that allows us for a much better reconstruction of the early modern conflict than probably any other period. And that's related to the urbanization, the expansion of literacy, the ability to really to produce this memoir literature, which shapes so much of what we know. But the related side to it is the one that I think, Zach, you alluded to, and that is the expansion and transformation of what state is about. So in my own research, I highlight one of the accomplishments, and again, I'm not pronouncing whether it's a good or bad. I usually ask students to write essays to assess whether it is a positive or negative effect, is the expansion of state under Napoleonic rule, right? The expansion of efficiency of both control, surveillance, extraction of resources, mobilization, We've talked about the conscription. We've talked about the tax system that Napoleon certainly reformed and exported. All that is part of the war. However, again, when we talk about the nature of the war, I don't think it approaches the totality of it. Having said, the original question was about war as a continuation of foreign policy, and if I may track back myself to that question, I do believe that the war is indeed the continuation of foreign policy through other means or by other means, however we want to put it. But the quick question, right? The key question is, at what point, as you pointed out, Zach, does it simply starts becoming a war? And you see that during the Napoleonic Wars at many points, when Napoleon or his opponents don't necessarily have a clear-cut policy that the war supports. And that's a problem that sustains the Napoleonic Wars as a period during which we have only few breaks in between and a decade full of violence.
I want to bring Beatrice, I'll come to you in a moment, Charles, but I want to bring Beatrice in because she's been keen to say something all the way through that. Beatrice, take it away.
Yes, I wanted to respond to the 2 points made about the either or not the continuation or the discontinuation of the Napoleonic times, and then also about this continuation of war as foreign policy. I think for me, still one of the most important keywords, also making sense of foreign politics and policies, is trauma and is the terror that the war inflicted, not just in the societies and the populaces, but also in the statesmen themselves. And there is lots of work being done on the Napoleonic Wars, the Revolutionary Napoleonic Wars, as also a turning point in how people articulated and disseminated their emotions. The emotional turn in history, but also before that, Lynn Hunt, American historian, who wrote about how empathy was disseminated in epistolary novels, in poems, in texts, because there was one aspect on the Napoleonic Wars that it tied together so many continents and so many peoples. So novels were being written about that already in the Enlightenment, of course, but then also in the war times that were spread across Europe. Sir Walter Scott, for example, Austen, who also directly or indirectly thematized the wars. In the Netherlands, there were also a couple of novels that came out. In Germany, the Wars of Liberation, of course, sparked off a whole new era of romantic thought and writings. So in that sense, the war was total and that it inspired throughout society. And well, was the war in itself total, or was the experience different? And was there more extensive writing about it? Probably also the latter to a great extent. And if you also can see what, for example, Castlereagh or Wellington or the Dutch envoys, what they read, and I have a PhD who's now trying to piece together what those statesmen took with them in their suitcases to Vienna, for example, or to Paris, what they were reading. They were reading the novels of Walter Scott, for example, novels of Byron. In the Netherlands, lots of novels as well, thematizing the horrors of war and communicating with each other about that. And if you read their letters and read their negotiations in Vienna, in Paris, you can also see that they refer to these traumas, to these horrors. A never again experience was also there at the Green Bay stables and the slaughter. It was not just national interest, it was also deep felt transnational emotions. And this is something that ties this war aspect of trauma and experience together with the new foreign policy that came out of that.
I know Charles wanted to say something and Alex wants to, so I'll allow you both to respond before we then move on. Charles first.
Well, the point, just briefly, a point about war and foreign policy. In the brief break that you have in the conflict between Britain and France in 1802 to 1803, Napoleon simply continues war by means of foreign policy. He doesn't let up in his hostility. Equally, you can say the same thing about periods of peace between France and Austria, between France and Russia. Napoleon goes on being Napoleon, and that's why those powers are forced back to war with him. The point I wanted to make about the written word comes directly from my experience of Spain and the historiography of the Peninsular War. When I began my work back in 1980 or whatever it was, virtually the only serious study that one had, other than narrow military studies, of the Peninsular War was Gabriel Lovett's book, Napoleon and the Birth of Modern Spain. And I read that and I reread that, and I have read it God knows how many times since. And it's a very important book. But I think he makes a fundamental error in that he goes to the extensive Spanish press sources. I mean, there were dozens and dozens of newspapers coming out all over Spain every day. There's an explosion of the press. There are hundreds of pamphlets, broadsides, manifestos, apologia being issued all over the place all the time. There's a collection in Madrid, the Colección Documental del Fraile, which is something like 1,150 volumes of this stuff. Now, if you read a lot of that material, particularly the material coming out in 1808 at the start of the war, you have a picture of total war. You have absolute hatred of Napoleon, absolute hatred of the French, absolute determination to wage war. You have claims that every single Spaniard is rushing out to go and fight Boney. That is wishful thinking. It's an imagined war. And it's a war which simply doesn't happen. And you go into the archives and you find it's all hogwash. Partly, it's hogwash designed by the elites to persuade people that the people are fighting. And because that will deal, if you've got problems in, I don't know, La Coruña or somewhere, if you've got conscription riots there, if you can persuade everybody in La Coruña that everybody else is fighting, then you might just get things to settle down. So part is a con trick, and partly it's just wishful thinking. And the net result is you end up with Lovett's perfectly well-researched, well thought out portrayal of the Peninsular War, which is drawn from one set of sources. And I fear my unworthy efforts, which were drawn from a rather different set of sources, which for the most part have never been touched. And I'm afraid to say that the result is that I am extremely skeptical of attempts to use the literature, the press, as a means of, if you like, telling us how the wars were like. What they give us is how the wars were portrayed.
Yes, but isn't that exactly the point? I really, from a more constructivist point of view, people consider the situations as real. They're real in the consequences and the way, the Thomas theory. So if that was the way reality was portrayed or conveyed, it's what Napoleon did in his bulletins for the Grande Armée, trying to shape reality. It was strategic communication, as you say. But I'm also referring to the letters, so not just the press, letters written home. It's, by the way, Matilda Greig, Dead Men Telling Tales, the literature written, the memoirs written by Waterloo veterans from all over the place, makes for massive, impressive reading, which counted for the way the wars were imagined and fed into the policies of the time. So whether they portrayed the war in its exact military minute details, of course, I don't know, perhaps not. But on the other hand, in those letters, they did not always have reason to blow up things or obfuscate things. And it's very much a kind of a wave of ideas, of notions, of poems that informed a new public consciousness after the war.
If you're talking about public consciousness after the war, that's a slightly different issue. I do accept that in the wake of the wars, you do get the creation of, well, in Spain, the great national myth that is drawn, you know, precisely from the sort of writings I've been talking about. And in terms of the letters written by soldiers, I mean, Alan Forrest and who's the chap in Belgium who's written about the letters from the soldiers who came from the area around Liège. Will come back to me. Anyway, I'm aware of the books written by people like Alan Forrest looking at French soldiers' letters, and for the most part, what you get is a very worm's eye view. My memory, sometimes since I've read the things, but you know, these are letters which are not couched in ideological terms. They're about, hey, Mum, I got a bit of sausage today.
Charles, you were referring to Bernard Wilkins's
That's it. That's
book.
it. Thank you. Yeah.
Fighting for Napoleon. Yeah, they're very interesting. Yeah, they're a very interesting volume. Zach, as a warning, this discussion will not end.
I'm quite conscious of that.
But I gotta ruffle some feathers here, Charles. Is Napoleon the only one, though? Because you know, when you say that Napoleon was waging war through other means, even in peacetime, I think they all do. That's so I don't know if we can really blame Napoleon for exploiting it. Because the Russians are equally eager to do so, right? And in our podcast with our good friend Alex Stevenson, I gotta plug it in here.
Smoothly done. Well done.
Charles and I, we've talked about how much attention is placed on France and how much we oftentimes ignore events in Poland, where we see exact same thing here: exploitation of a moment to pursue foreign policy by other means. Later on, when all of Europe is focused on Napoleon's conquest, we see Russian expansion of the Danubian principalities. And when the French confronted the Russian foreign minister and told them to stop expanding into the Danubian principalities, the foreign minister famously responds, and I quote, "The Ottoman Empire is already dead, so why shouldn't Russia enjoy the spoils of it?" So you see this kind of opportunistic moment. And I see that, I think, in all of these key moments where the war is perceived as part of the foreign policy. And if opportunity is given, you have to grasp it. You have to grab it.
Which leads in very nicely to, thank you, Alex, because you've actually formed a bridge to where I wanted to take this next, which was to look at kind of the mechanics behind foreign policy. See, there is a plan behind this, folks. And Alex, being a pro, he's worked it out and solved all the problems for me. Looking at the mechanics of the way in which foreign policy is conducted during this period, because as you say, you can throw a lot of accusations with a heck of a lot of justification at different individuals, certainly in regards to underhand dealings. I'm thinking of Metternich. Buyer's regret is often leveled at Britain in relation to the Peace of Amiens. You've got plain stabbing your ally in the back, looking at you, Napoleon, in relation to Spain in 1808. So it's worth kind of looking at those practicalities of how it works, because I suspect in the process we'll shed a little light on all of those points. So kind of what is the process here? And, you know, let's kind of think about war and peace kind of seeming to be going on fairly constantly between one nation and another during this period. Charles, do you want to start on that? Because you were keen to respond to Alex as it was.
Yeah, I mean, what I was going to say to Alex was that it's essentially a point I've been making on Facebook these past couple of days. Yes, of course, all powers had their own interests. Some of them long-term interests, some of them short-term interests, which arose because conditions had changed. All of them, Britain, Prussia, Russia, Austria, France, all of them, they do not lose sight of those national interests. The question is whether they pursue them to such an extent that the practical constraints which had been recognized by most statesmen in the 18th century, most monarchs in the 18th century, were thrown aside. And also the extent to which those national interests were placed before, well, in the case of France's opponents, before fighting the French Revolution and or Napoleon. So all powers are imperialistic. All powers believe in dynastic foreign policy or its equivalents. Across the board, of course they do. But I think the difference with Napoleon is that he does not recognize the constraints which most other statesmen recognized.
And
what I'll say is most other statesmen recognized that international relations was a game that you played with the other powers. A game in which everybody had stakes, everybody had interests, and in which nobody could absolutely go for broke. You had to recognize the interests of the other powers. And I always said to my students, it's exactly the same in a friendship. Friendship is about give and take. Détente is about give and take. Napoleon was incapable of that, and that's why it all goes wrong. And it is that which makes them so different, I think, from the other statesmen of Europe.
Let me bring Alex straight in response to that. I'm not pushing Beatrice to the side here, but I'm very conscious that you've got three people in the room who are not particularly keen on Napoleon when it comes to foreign policy. Alex, I'm not suggesting that you're necessarily going to disagree with Charles, but I'm interested in your take.
Oh, I will. No. Because again, if we all agree on something, that's going to be rather a lame debate here. A chamber or echoing chamber here. No, I want to take it again. I will disagree with Charles to a point that Napoleon does take the other powers' interest into account. For example, Tilsit is a good example of it. Tilsit is a treaty in which Napoleon compromises with Russia to a significant extent. So how can you ignore that?
But Alex, I don't ignore it. Yes, of course he comes to an agreement with your namesake, but he can't live by it. He doesn't respect it. He doesn't behave as if Alexander is his friend. Within 2.5 years, he's completely alienated the guy with whom he could have won the war. France and Russia are pretty unbeatable. And
same accusations can be thrown at Alexander. See, that's the thing, is that how unique is Napoleon's position? I see Napoleon's position unique in that he's a capable guy. He's a very capable guy. And the contemporaries grudgingly respect him, right? In that sense that his ability and talent to bring about success. Now, with that success, and I agree with you, Charles, comes significant ambition and ego. But we also see that on the other side, there are no less egos involved, no less ambitions involved. When Alex, for example, my namesake, the Russian emperor, is told about an armistice that is negotiated by his commander with the Turks, which was the preliminary for a possible peace with the Ottoman Empire, he shuts it down right away because, and I quote, that is unworthy of Russia's honor. That's something Napoleon could have easily said, unworthy of France's honor, and demanded to fight the Turks, continue to fight the Turks after 1807, because he needed, or he wanted to push the boundaries to the Danube River and force the Turks to give up Bessarabia, Moldavia, Wallachia. Ultimately, it's Napoleon's invasion of Russia that forces Alex to back down and get only Bessarabia. But if he had a chance, he would have done exactly the same thing that Napoleon was doing to the other powers. So I don't see Napoleon necessarily different in his pursuit of foreign policy. He's just has more resources, maybe more talent. Although ultimately he overplays his hand. After 1812, he clearly could have compromised, could have made a deal, and he didn't. That's a separate story, I think. And I think the Russian invasion is a game changer. I'm sorry, Beatrice, to keep you waiting.
Yeah, absolutely.
No problem at all. I'd love to listen and think hard, because I do disagree with you. And I'm trying to make...
Which one?
Exactly. Now you have to be quiet and let me make my argument, because that's difficult enough to stand up to you as it is. Well, the point is not that Napoleon did things so completely different from the other leaders. I agree with you there. But the point is, what was his vision? What was his vision of the international relations system of Europe as it was back then? And there, I think he really tried to revolutionize the notion, the idea of the international relations system. For the other leaders, you could argue that they still vied for a position within this old system of Europe, where predominantly, I would say, the Habsburg Empire, the Translatio Imperii, was one of the main empires. The Holy Roman Emperor, he was the one who was the Katagon. He would there was still this notion that he would do away, he was the eschatological presence on earth. Well, these were old-fashioned notions and they were becoming obsolete, but they were still there. And you could argue that 1804, 1805, 1886 were turning points in the way Napoleon shaped the vision, the image, the future perhaps even of international relations system. First of all, he crowned himself emperor, which really was a novelty. And then he besieged the Austrians in 1805, the Prussians in 1806. He established the Confederation of the Rhine, and Francis abdicated as an emperor, which was a real fundamental tectonic shift in the international relations. This is also the same time where in a United Kingdom, Pitt and Alexander, they kind of have an exchange of letters in 1805, and they say, well, we need to think hard. Things are changing in Europe. Napoleon is reinventing the whole system, and we need to think about a new balance of power, not to wage war, but to create and maintain peace afterwards, which is, I really think this is one of the most seminal moments, and this text of 1805, perhaps one of the most seminal plans, the Pitt Plan, because it was the answer to Napoleon's revolutionizing of the international system in saying, well, we, the British and the Russians, have to come up with a preponderance for Europe. We have to implement a balance of power system, not as it was in the 18th century for preparing for war, for maintaining the peace in an attempt for collective security, which was still very hierarchical. And I don't agree with Paul Schroeder, who says it's only those two powers. We can discuss that later. But it was, and we're not saying that they were right, but Napoleon started it, but also the British and the Russians, they were reinventing international relations, but also the eschatology, where it all had to go to. It was almost transcendental how they thought about international relations, which is a new and novel way of thinking about it. And this is, I think, something where Napoleon departed from his predecessors.
I completely agree with you in that sense. I said.
Oh, that's a pity.
No, I agree with you that Napoleon's transformation of international system is a fact because of the sheer success of his 1805, 1806, 1807. And I also, I think, would agree with Charles in the sense that Napoleon had a chance in 1806 to come up with a better peace with British. He should have exploited the opportunity when Charles Fox was reaching out, this was a moment for him. But I can also, you can rationalize why he didn't, even though it would be just a lame excuse for it. What my argument was is that I cannot imagine, let's say, Austria being as successful as Napoleon in 1805, 1806, 1807, and not pursuing the same policy. That's where Charles has a very good point that all of these powers are opportunistic, expansionist, they're predatory. When given an opportunity, they will predate on neighboring states. When given a chance, remember that in 1805, it is Austria who invades Bavaria, right? It's a neighboring state, and we know how the relationship between Bavaria and Austria was. And we know that Austrian intentions toward Bavaria were quite predatory. So that's the point I think I'm making more than anything else, that Napoleon has plenty of flaws. There's a lot of things we can, I think, criticize for, but this is not one of them, at least not entirely his fault.
And this taps into a really fundamental question, doesn't it? Why is there, and it sounds very simple, but why is there so much war during this period? Because quite obviously it's not all about Napoleon, not least because it's not until 1799 that he is in a position as head of state to be able to dictate where France is going from a foreign policy perspective. Yes, obviously he plays a pivotal role in relation to what happens out in Egypt, but that's something that you can kind of set to one side as an aspect of French foreign policy. So there's a lot else going on here. There are 7 coalitions in the space of 25 years, give or take. What I suspect is kind of underpinning this is also a question of trust. To what extent is there a lack of trust amongst these different individuals? And to what extent does that generate a greater inclination towards war? So why is there no lasting peace? Yes, Charles, go for it.
I'd like to go back to Beatrice's point, with which I both agree, or in half of it I agree with, half of it I kind of disagree with. I don't think Napoleon is doing anything. I agree. Napoleon creates a different Europe, getting rid of the Holy Roman Empire. Yes, I agree. It's a tectonic shift. Beatrice is entirely right. It's massively important. Napoleon creates a very different Europe from the Europe that had existed until 1789 or even afterwards. That's not in dispute. Was, however, Napoleon creating a new Europe in any modernizing sense? Yeah, I know all about state building reforms and all that business, but no, let's think about the Europe he conceived. No, I don't think he was. I think he was just a throwback to a Roman emperor. Where I totally agree with Beatrice is the way in which the powers, yes, all of them predatory. Alexander is absolutely right. Gradually come, and it starts off as Beatrice says with the exchange of letters in 1805. The powers gradually come to realize that it can no longer be a question of dog eat dog. That a situation has arisen, and this is where I'll come back to your question, Sam. A situation has arisen which is simply unsustainable. And Vienna settlement and the Congress system which follows is all about ensuring order and harmony in international relations. It's all about avoiding war. And that is why the many people who struck their stuff on Twitter condemning the Vienna settlement, that is why they are so completely wrong. The Vienna settlement is not regressive. It's not about turning the clock back.
Here. Thank you, Charles.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about creating a new Europe, and it is really something which one can only applaud. Now, to go. I mean, I'm not saying it worked. I'm not saying it didn't have its faults. I'm not saying that it was possibly even likely to work, but at least they tried. Now, going back to Zach's question about why is there so much war? Well, there'd always been war in Europe all through the 18th century. Not entirely certain there's that much more war than there had in more war in 1810 than there had been in 1710, or any other comparison you can come up with. What I think is the case is that even happy thought, had Napoleon got his head shot off at Lodi or somewhere like that, I think that and indeed, even had the French Revolution not happened, I think that Europe was heading for a major crash in terms of international relations in the 1790s and early 1800s. Revolves around the disappearance of Poland as a buffer in Eastern Europe. But I think something very, very nasty was always on the cards. It just so happens that it happened in the context of of the French Revolution, and by extension Napoleon. I'm sorry, that's far too much for me. I will now shut up.
But I want to. Sorry, Beatrice, go for it. Yeah.
Very briefly ask Alex and Charles something. How do you see this discussion between Metternich and Napoleon exactly on this aspect, on do you like more war or not, in November 1813 during the Frankfurter proposals? And Metternich said, I was appalled that Napoleon took into account so many more human lives, and I didn't want that anymore, but he did, sort of rephrasing the argument. So what do you think? Was Napoleon hell-bent on creating more battles and raising more armies till he was finally a master and conqueror of the whole of Europe? Do you believe Metternich, or was it all a ploy? I mean, this was a moment where more bloodshed could have been prevented.
I believe.
The sparks will fly now. You just want.
Right, okay. First of all, I do not necessarily believe anything that Metternich says. Simply because Metternich says something doesn't mean to say it's correct.
True.
That said, whether he said it or not, I believe that Napoleon was inseparably wedded, indissolubly wedded to the notion of glory, to the notion of war. It was absolutely fundamental to him. It was what he was. And he talked about, the moment I cease to be feared, I'm nothing. That's just a piece of self-justification, because actually the powers of Europe would have been perfectly happy to live with him for the most part. Napoleon needed war. It's what he was. And so even if Metternich invented it, it was a very, very plausible thing to have invented. Because yes, I do believe that Napoleon, just as he had done in 1807, in 1813, Napoleon had a chance for a compromise peace. I genuinely believe that. I mean, how can I prove it? But I honestly believe that was the case. And he threw it away. And he threw it away because taking it would have meant that he was less than Napoleon.
Charles, let me just come back, because I want to bring Alex in, but before I do, just come back to you with the common claim that I see being made by those who say, oh, well, Napoleon couldn't possibly have accepted the peace proposals in 1813. You covered the question of whether or not they were made in good faith, to which you argued, yes, they were. There was a potential for a compromise peace. Talk is often made of the coronation oath and how it wasn't possible to accept the proposals because that would have countered the oath that Napoleon had taken at the point of coronation. What's your response to that? Because I'm sure you've got some pithy remarks to make in that sense.
I can even do it in French. La santé, c'est une bagatelle.
Apologies, but I'm not a linguist.
The oath, a mere form of words, and nothing. He broke his word all the time. He would not have a problem with breaking his oath. Sorry, but there it is. Now, in terms of practical problems, what would have happened had he come back from where was the meeting with Metternich, Dresden? Had he come back from Dresden with a compromise peace, and this is what he could have got, which would have left France in control of the Low Countries, Holland and Belgium, which would have left France in control of Northern Italy, because Metternich was happy to give him that.
I'm Sandra, and I'm just the professional your small business was looking for. But you didn't hire me because you didn't use LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn has professionals you can't find anywhere else, including those who aren't actively looking for a new job, but might be open to the perfect role, like me.
In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you'll miss out on great candidates like Sandra. Start hiring professionals like a professional. Post your free job on linkedin.com/spoken today.
Millions of people have lost weight with personalized plans from Noom, like Evan, who can't stand salads and still lost 50 pounds.
Salads generally for most people are the easy button, right? For me, that wasn't an option. I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. But Noom worked for me.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
Britain wouldn't have been happy, but Britain could not have fought on her own. Britain always needs continental allies. What would have happened in France? There'd have been bonfires on every single corner. The people would have been in the streets cheering. There would have been absolute joy. The people of France were sick of war. They were desperate for it to end. And had Napoleon somehow brought it to an end, his popularity would have soared. In other words, the whole point is rubbish. Pure and simple.
I think you've sent them off with a flea in their ear there, Charles. But Alex, let me bring you in.
I could argue again. I could have come up with a better rationale than that, Zach. There are ways you can respond, or at least rationalize why Napoleon didn't accept the offer in the summer of, or even the late fall of 1813, and the Constitutional Oath will be the worst of them all. Because if we look at the oath itself, if memory serves me right, he swore to maintain the integrity of the territory of the Republic. That is all, how do you define that? What is, Republic is already gone, and what is the territory of the Republic? Because in 1805, that's a very different territory than it is in 1813. And not to mention that the territories in question are not necessarily the territories of the Republic, but rather the territories of other states that France conquered. And most importantly, at the end of the oath did ask him to govern in the sole interest of happiness and glory of the French people. And as Charles pointed out, peace would have brought a lot of happiness to the French people. I'm usually willing to cut some slack to Napoleon and put him in the wider context. I think 1813 is an exception for me, because he indeed had an opportunity to negotiate and find and come up with a solution to the war that would have allowed him to stay in power. No, despite all his rhetoric that he had with Metternich, that the war is what he needed in order to survive. He didn't need to be that warmongering 1813 period kind of a man to survive this downfall, to survive the setback in Russia and stay in power. The empire, if he had made a deal in the fall of 1813, would have lived longer than it did.
Bravo, Alex. I knew you weren't all bad.
This is turning out to be oddly harmonious, isn't it? Let's move the discussion on to somewhere where you might disagree, because, hey, we brought you all together so that the sparks will fly. That's what people are tuning in for, surely. In all seriousness, though, putting my facetious response aside, I do want to take this to in a direction where we discuss the domestic side of things, because it's important, I think, to consider political systems amongst other things. It's sometimes said, and Charles has sort of alluded to this already, that Napoleon won the battle for history, and there are multiple ways of looking at that. One is the endurance of that hugely frustrating Napoleon was a man without flaws and everything he did was an excusable thing line of thinking, which does my head in. Another is the fact that Napoleon sells, right? I mean, look at the number of books that can get written about this guy. Writing on his vanquishers really doesn't sell in the same way. I mean, look at the gift shop at Waterloo. Charles, you've made this point in your own writing. You would think that Napoleon won. You wouldn't even know that there was a Wellington or a Blucher involved in all of this. If you
do you know the most awful thing about the battlefield of Waterloo?
I do. It's that statue of Napoleon that stands on the Allied Bridge. Actually, no, sorry, correction. The worst thing about the Waterloo battlefield is the Victor Hugo monument, and do not get me started on that. The second worst thing is that statue of Napoleon, as far as I'm concerned.
But the worst thing of all is that you can see the bloody thing from space. If you look at the Google images image of Mont Saint-Jean, it's taken on a sunny day, and you can actually see the shadow of Napoleon there projected on the ground.
Oh, I'm happy to hear that. I dig that.
It is unspeakable. Yeah, I mean, we are stuck with Napoleonic legends. I will fight it all my life. I will go down fighting, but I will never win.
This is true. Another element of this, of course, is the politics of Napoleonic France. Napoleon has that reputation as a reformer, as an administrator and a Democrat. People know that I have huge issues with the latter, especially. What, therefore, would you say were the norms in terms of domestic policy during this period? And I'm kind of deliberately leaving that as a broad question so that you can take it where you like. And then how unique was Napoleonic France in comparison? Because we talk about autocracy, right? And folks like me will turn around and say, well, look, let's not forget Napoleon was a dictator. Now, the counter argument would always be, well, yeah, but, the autocratic systems across Europe were no great thing either. Fine. But let me get your thoughts on all of those kinds of arguments. Beatrice, do you want to start us off on this?
Yes, yeah, this is again a very fascinating question. I did a small poll on Twitter with a colleague of mine, Lotte Jensen, who is a very famous historian in the Netherlands working on the images and the whole culture after Napoleon, how Napoleon was being mediatized in the Netherlands. And we thought that the outcome would be pretty negative. As it was in Britain. And it was a similar poll in Britain saying, I think 70% abhorred of Napoleon. But in the Netherlands, to our great astonishment, it was the other way around. 70 or even more percent thought that Napoleon had been good for the Netherlands, which totally shocked me. And people were pointing, as was with his commemoration only a couple of weeks ago, people were pointing to all his successes, but also all his reforms on the domestic front, for example, the names, the addresses, people were even naming conscription as an asset, the Napoleonic Code, of course, the fact that these old medieval powers of the guilds were abolished, freedom of profession was brought about. So yes, there were quite a lot of reforms that Napoleon implemented and forced, more or less, in the Netherlands. But what they did not mention was, as I said, during those last years, you were mentioning before, Charles, that the wars weren't that bad given compared to other wars, but in the Netherlands and also in Germany, demographics decreased. So it meant that there was a mortality surplus in the Netherlands and in the German lands, which hadn't happened after the medieval times.
Sorry, Beatrice, you misunderstood me. No, I am very, very well aware of the horrendous effects
Okay, sorry. Then
of the Napoleonic Wars on the Netherlands, on Germany. What I actually said was that if you take Europe as a whole, I'm not entirely certain that war was any worse in 1810 than it was in 1710. In other words, there were plenty of people, well, in France, for example, which suffered atrociously in 1709, 1710, 1711. All I'm saying is that you have the same sort of experiences as you had in Napoleonic Europe.
Yes.
In the Europe of Louis XIV.
Okay, I understand, but the point I was trying to make now, and so that aligns with your point, Charles. The point is that in 1815, the Netherlands were worse off in terms of human lives, in terms of authoritarian control. The gendarmerie in the Netherlands was established. There was military police, not just in the Netherlands, also in other countries surrounding France, and in Italy, for example. There were secret intelligence agencies. This was not something that Napoleon did, of course. The Prussians and the Austrians also worked with that, but he gave it a true boost, and people learned from how Fouché policed society, l'esprit public. This was the concept that Napoleon introduced to monitor and to surveil public perception of the rulers. So there was a lot going on the domestic front that was truly revolutionary, but in a sense that it supported the unitary repressive nation state rather than that reinforced the whole notion of human rights. And well, you had this discussion before, Zach, on your podcast, but Napoleon also reinstated slavery, and he was not a great fan, to say the least, about women's rights. So I think that on the whole, this poll that we did in the Netherlands was completely wrong. People have a complete wrong, I would say, impression of what Napoleon brought.
Yeah, I totally hear everything that you say. As we were talking about earlier, I'm very involved in Napoleonic Twitter, and it is absolutely extraordinary the number of people who seem to think that they can simply pronounce upon Napoleon and his rule, and when you sort of probe them a little bit, oh, I've never read that. I've never read that. I've never read a biography of Napoleon, and you just think, wow. So of course there's a lot of ignorance out there, and yes, I truly do believe, Beatrice, that the Napoleonic legacy was fundamentally negative for all the sorts of reasons that you come up with. I'm a Spanish historian, really. You're never ever going to get me to agree that the tendencies that produce the Guardia Civil, with all the dreadful things that institution has done up until the current era, you're never going to get me to agree that that was a positive development. And yet it was a development which is inspired by the Napoleonic gendarmerie.
Let me bring Alex in then.
Wow, yeah, there's a lot to mull about here. Again, to let the sparks fly, Charles said Napoleon's legacy was fundamentally negative. I think that's how he wrote it down.
Absolutely.
I don't share that fundamentally part of it. There are elements of Napoleonic reforms that were progressive. There are elements of it that were beneficial. Tax restructuring, administrative restructuring, legal reforms, educational reforms. There are points you can make that these reforms brought benefit to the population. What I usually, when I have this debate with my students, what I ask them is to consider whether the model of Napoleonic government and administration, which was based on centralization, efficiency, uniformity, whether that would have an appeal to you as a common person, whether rural or urban. Would increased taxation be of appeal to you? Would a crucial element of the modern of this process of creating modern nation state, such as conscription and professional bureaucracy, would they appeal to you? Beatrice mentioned a very crucial element in the story, and that is increased surveillance and policing. Would that appeal to you? Because there are parts of me that say, hey, a tax reorganization and a more efficient tax system is not a bad thing. It certainly is part of our modern day life, and I don't think we complain much about having a progressive tax system. We also don't seem to complain about professionalization of administration and bureaucracy. If anything, we complain about the lack of it. That is part of Napoleonic legacy. So I don't know. So that's why I don't think it's a fundamental negative thing.
But progressive taxation, Alex. I'm not very au fait with the American tax system, but in Britain we certainly have an extremely progressive taxation system. The more you earn, the more you pay, and that goes into the common pot. The Napoleonic tax system was anything but progressive. It imposed all the burden on the common people. It spared property. It was fundamentally regressive. And if you take the Napoleon's educational reforms, yes, the lycée were and remain extremely good schools. They also gave France a deeply, deeply elitist political culture, which I do not believe has served her well. I think that almost everything that Napoleon did, the prefects, centralization, was that a good thing? I'm not certain it was. Again, I'd go to the Spanish example, where you had a copy of the French system introduced, and it's all very Napoleonic, and look at all the problems which came out of that. Almost all of these so-called reforms have got a pretty questionable side. And finally, if you take the Code Napoleon, well, yes, okay, it survives in French law, and I believe in Belgian law and some other places, but it's been shorn of almost everything that Napoleon did to it. It's had all the Napoleonic excrescences stripped away from it. So I think there are huge problems with what is, frankly, Alex, an American motion that keeps coming up over and over again, that somehow the creation of the creation of this new state, Napoleonic style state, across Europe was a good thing. And I don't buy it. I really don't.
Can I briefly tune in here, or would you like to say something first, Alex?
No, Beatrice, please do, and I'll respond to Charles after you.
Yes, because I want to tie in with that argument that you're making, Charles. I think I agree with you, although I would like to state that there was a real aspect of modernization. It was a bureaucratic revolution that Napoleon imposed, and we may like it or not like it, but that was what happened. And well, today it's the 11th of September, 20 years ago, while we're taping it, and I cannot help thinking back about how today's national security states that waged wars, that outlawed minorities, that adopted alien bills, that provided blacklists, this was all going on already. Of course, not with the whole technological display of force, but if Napoleon would have had it, he would have done it. He was the one introducing optic telegraph systems. He was the one who embraced modernity and technology, all for identifying, assessing his enemies, and also preventing enemies from rising up. So he was the one who invented counterinsurgency, and it was also used against him. And then after he was besieged, of course, and I wrote a book about it, the Allied Council was created, which took over all of the Napoleonic novelties. But you could argue that the unitary nation states, the national security states, even the term sécurité nationale was coined in this period against terror. Terror, of course, of the French Revolution of of the Bonapartists, but also terror, l'esprit public, the fausse nouvelle, the fake news that arose in the hearts and the minds of the people that needed to be controlled. So Napoleon was all for turning the society in a kind of a controlled entity that would support his war machinery, which is something like a military-industrial complex. I know I may be overcharging it a bit here, but I think the roots of this modern national security state system were sowed in this period. And it's not a coincidence that all references to human rights, to the Declaration of Human Rights, all the freedoms, the liberties, they were removed from the constitutions. Also after Napoleon's return, it's sometimes claimed that he came back as a peace emperor. Well, I don't buy it.
Thank you, Beatrice. I agree totally. I agree. I absolutely agree with what you're saying. If you take out the notion that somehow total war existed in the Napoleonic Wars, and when you take that out of the equation, I could agree with everything that you're saying. And really am uncomfortable about somehow the notion that Napoleon's legacy was positive. I find that really dark.
Charles, again, I take an issue with that. You're making a blanket statement that I think has quite a few holes in it. I mean, going back to taxes again. I think the way the term progressive that I use is not necessarily in terms of tax rates that you pointed out, but in terms of how a tax system was structured. So reducing direct taxes, to me, which is one of the great legacies of Napoleon, at least in the French-controlled territories, was a benefit. In 1813, direct taxes only accounted for 29% of total receipts of the French. So that's, to me, is an important element, because what Napoleon does is he restructures the balance of tax system in favor of indirect taxes, which he believes will raise more revenue than the direct taxes, which lay usually more heavily on taxpayers. So he taxes things like tobacco, liquor, salt, and other things, which do produce plenty of taxes. Now, to me, that's an important legacy. Now, I don't know why would you say that that's not a positive legacy to restructure it in favor of indirect and opposed to direct taxes?
Because
same applies. Yeah.
Because
go ahead.
For a tax system to be fair, and I guess, Alex, we're talking about a difference between the American system and the British system, and possibly, I mean, Beatrice, I have no idea about taxation in the Netherlands. But perhaps you can inform us. But taxation has to be, I genuinely believe, progressive and redistributive, something or other. In other words, you take money from people who have got money and you give it to people who have less money. And the way you do that is through direct taxation, because direct taxation hits people with money, whereas indirect taxation hits people who have no money or have less money. And that is where I stand. Yes, and as a taxpayer, I was on the highest rate for many years. I paid 40%. Yes. I paid 40% because that's what I should have paid. And I see that as being absolutely fundamental to a decent, progressive society. And that is where I stand.
Okay, and I think you've made that case strongly, Charles, but I'm conscious that Alex had other points that you wanted to make as counterpoints to your argument. So Alex, let me bring you back in. You are on mute though.
And again, I don't want to monopolize the time, and I know we have other issues that I'm sure that Zach wants to discuss. But to go back to this issue, again, one of Napoleonic legacies, the one that he started in 1807, but will be done later on, will be the system of cadastre. So they kept it because it was important, the legacy. They kept it because it restructured a crucial element of the modern, that underlies the modern French state. So that's where, again, I think this debate will continue for time. So I'm willing to just shut up and listen what Zach has for us.
Thanks, Alex. I am keen that we move things on, not least because I don't want to keep you all day, and I know that you all have other engagements. You're all people in demand. Because I do want to talk about the international dimension here. I feel that is important not to just be purely focused on Europe. So what are the political ripple effects of this period across the wider world? And I'm thinking both in terms of political theory and thinking, approaches to foreign policy, and of course in relation to colonialism, because we were discussing this on Twitter. In fact, there is work on the extent to which things like the Code of Napoleon actually informed much of the codification that took place across the world, not least in South America. Jacek Drzeziak is the chap from Poland who's writing a PhD thesis as we speak on exactly this kind of question. So in terms of those areas, political theory and thinking, foreign policy, colonialism, what is the impact of this period?
Well, perhaps I could raise some flags, if I may, because I think the impact was massive. And I wrote about this and I made the case before. You could argue that even something of a NATO or an EU kind of commission was created. It didn't live that long, and there's discussion on how impactful it was, but it was called the Allied Council. It was created out of the 6th and the 7th Coalition, and it convened in Paris in July 1815 and remained in place for a couple of years, and afterwards was transformed in a series of ambassadorial conferences. And some people even like to call it a European Council for the Management of the Affairs of the World. It was, of course, a British, more derogative moniker, but it was true that ministers, diplomats, financial experts, police officers, bankers, they were all there. And it was a kind of an even more effective, practical translation of the balance of power thinking into practical international politics on the ground. And the council dealt with taxes, as we just discussed. It also dealt with treaties and fortifications, with fortresses, with the indemnities that France had to pay, but also with new treaties, the Quadruple Alliance. It even discussed with France, invited back to the table as the Cinq Court Mediatrices. It even discussed whether the European powers should intervene in America. So it was a kind of a self-proclaimed Security Council, also dealing with economy, which was based on the principle of collective security. They even called it mutual security. And David Todd, he wrote a seminal book in which he also described how from that moment on, driven together by the Napoleonic Wars, they were hitched to the hips for 25 years, pretty much. Well, of course, they were also fighting each other, but in the later years of the wars, they were together and they campaigned together through mud, through rain, which did something. They all knew each other. And then also the years thereafter, when they still lived, Alexander and Castlereagh, they died or committed suicide too early, but they worked together, not just in Europe, but also in fighting the Barbary pirates. My PhD, Eric de Lange, wrote about this. They worked together, as David Todd describes, on the open sea. So this was not the beginning of imperial competition only. It was also inter-imperial cooperation. Treaty of 1824 between the UK and the Netherlands, for example, in Southeast Asia. It divided the spheres of influence, as they had done in Europe, between the Dutch Indies, Indonesia, Singapore, India, the whole area. So you could make the case that the legacy of the Napoleonic Wars for the international system was something of the invention of a kind of a model of collective security, working together rather than only against each other. Of course, there were so many instances where it didn't work, where it unraveled, but they came back again. And very practically, in these ambassadorial conferences, there were not that many, only a handful in the years between Westphalian System 1815, and then from that moment on, every year there was somewhere an ambassadorial conference in place, dealing with all kinds of international aspects, which is really a transformation of the international system.
I would agree very, very, very strongly with that. And of course, I would also agree unfortunately, this transnational system, this attempt at European-wide harmony, didn't last. And one of the reasons it didn't last was, again, one of the legacies of the Napoleonic era, which is the rise of nationalism, which I see. This is me speaking as a European historian who's had to give survey courses on modern European history and so forth. And the rise of nationalism is catastrophic. Because apart from anything else, where does it end? I mean, yes, you can get all Germans together. Okay, what about all the Poles who live in areas like Poznania, which is part of Prussia, West Prussia, isn't it? What about all the Czechs in Bohemia? And so it goes on and on. All right, you give the Czechs a nation state eventually. It's called Czechoslovakia, but it's actually a Czech nation state. Well, how do the Slovaks feel about that? It's a can of words, and one which is frighteningly violent, which is based upon hatred. There is nothing pretty whatsoever about 19th century nationalism. And in that sense, the Napoleonic Wars, and it was really the Napoleonic Wars which did it, they open a Pandora's box, which Europe continues to pay for right up until 1945. And indeed, there have been resurgences of it since in Yugoslavia, and mercifully with far less bloodshed, almost no bloodshed, in fact, Spain.
Why do you think that's the case, that the Napoleonic Wars act as a catalyst for that, Charles? Because for folks who know about Linda Coley's work, she argues that this is the continuation of a process, isn't it? And that, so she starts her work in, 1700 and takes it all the way through to something like 1839. So she sees this very much as a longer term transition. But if I've read you correctly, what you're suggesting is that this becomes a flashpoint at which people really start to think about these things. Why would you say that's the case?
But Linda Colley herself argues that the French wars from 1793 to 1815 are an absolutely fundamental building brick of, and now this is where it gets difficult, British nationalism. Because there are all sorts of questions to be asked about the United Kingdom. What exactly are we? But certainly, she herself raised great emphasis on the revolutionary and Napoleonic period. If you take Spain, national Catholicism, and the doctrine which was the bedrock of Franco's Spain, that comes directly from the Spanish national myth, the idea of the Dos de Mayo and all of that. German nationalism. If you take starts off with the fairy tales of the Brothers Grimm, because German nationalism, like most other nationalisms, starts off as being a cultural movement. It's all about the preservation of German traditions. They don't have to worry about preserving the German language, perhaps, but certainly preserving German folk traditions. That's what the Grimm fairy tales are all about, and they get published in Beatrice, 1806. Yeah. Hey, how about that then? Okay. And that folk tradition you can find in German nationalism right up to Nazism. Anti-Semitism. Again, that's a feature of German nationalism in the Napoleonic Wars.
1812 they were.
Thank you. And that was me hoping that you were agreeing that it was 1806, but never mind. But the point I'm making is that wherever you look, the Napoleonic Wars gives this massive boost to a movement which is frankly one of the most destructive that the European continent has ever experienced.
Alex, let me bring you in relation to anything that you want to say in response to what Beatrice or Charles have said, but also in relation to that kind of original thrust of this, which is, you know, the ripple effects, if you will, of this period.
Yeah, I think I agree with both of them. So my answer will be very short. I think they've raised very important and pertinent points about the lasting legacy of Napoleonic Wars, which is complex, which is long-term, and a lot of it is kind of unpleasant to even contemplate, especially from a modern point of view. What I will, what I would like to do is move our attention to areas outside Europe, because in your question you talked about the colonial legacy, and there as well, right? Napoleonic Wars leaves us with a tremendous legacy, both in terms of emancipation of what used to be colonies, especially in the Western Hemisphere, but also with acquisition by European powers of new territories that were treated like colonial addendums to the imperial domains. And that's, if we go beyond the South Africa, the traditional kind of confines of South Africa and India, we can talk about territories like in the Caucasus, my own homeland, right? As a Georgian, I have to plug that part in. Or the profound legacy Napoleonic era had on the Middle East, which left enormous vacuum that will be filled in and will produce reverberations well throughout the 19th century. Or even for the United States, since I've lived here long enough to consider myself an American, the Napoleonic period is a crucial element in that reassessment, what this fledgling American Republic is about. And increasingly, the answer is imperial in nature. It's imperial in terms of American increased appetites for what used to be the Louisiana Territory, which Napoleon did sell to Americans. But if he hadn't, one wonders what would have happened, since there were plenty of senior officials and senior voices in the American government advocating a more forceful takeover of this territory. And of course, later on, the struggle for the fate of Canada really is determined during the Napoleonic era. And the sense of Americanism, this exceptionalism, is only reinforced by the struggle against the former imperial masters in the War of 1812. So, in my own recent research, this is the framework I'm advocating: is broadening our horizons and moving away from the emphasis on Europe, which is an epicenter of many of these power struggles, but considering the non-European areas' viewpoints, enrich our understanding of this period so much better. And Linda Corley, that Charles and Zach and Beatrice were referencing to in her last book, she certainly does that, right? She moves away from the constitutional narratives within Europe to encompass a far greater and far wider narrative and discussion, which shows you how impactful this period was.
Can I just pick up on the Americas? If you think about Latin America, who is the figure who comes to dominate, at least metaphorically, post-independence Latin America? What do you see emerging in country after country after country? You see pseudo-Napoleons. These are states which have problems of integration. They have problems which are essentially based on race, because you have the Indian majority. You also have very large slave populations particularly up in the Northeast, in Brazil, Cuba, and so forth. You have elites who are corrupt, self-seeking, quarrelsome, governments which are unstable. And what emerges? Military government. Santa Anna, as in the Alamo and all that business, he's called the Napoleon of the West. Alex, you're frowning, but I do believe he was.
I agree with you on that. The question I have for you is the question I think you raised at the beginning of this discussion, saying that if Napoleon had been shot on Lodi or at Arcola, the wars would have still taken place in Europe. So my counter argument would be to that: if Napoleon didn't invade in Spain, the Spanish Empire, how long the Spanish Empire would have endured, knowing the historical processes that were taking place in colonies. And in that context, if the Spanish Empire had collapsed, would you have the rise of strong men?
And probably. The question is whether the Spanish Empire would have collapsed, because I would base myself on the work of people like John Lynch, in the Spanish-American revolutions and things like that. What John Lynch argues is that prior to 1810, yes, of course, there were tensions, there were quarrels about this, there were quarrels about that. Godoy's policy in the Americas had been downright damaging in many ways to colonial interests. The wider history of what's called the Second Conquest, launched by King Charles III, much more intense exploitation of the empire. All of this had caused tremendous tensions. But John Lynch basically argues that you really cannot see any significant move towards support for independence. What does it is the destruction of the Junta Central in Spain in 1810. It looks like, because the whole of Andalusia falls in a fortnight. Seville, Granada, Malaga, they all capitulate virtually without resistance. The only place which holds out is Cadiz, and nobody can quite believe that that's going to hold out for very long. And when news reaches Latin America, or Spanish America, everywhere, well, no, not quite everywhere, but in a number of places, Venezuela, what becomes Argentina, you get revolutions which are essentially the local elite saying, holy hell, Spain has collapsed, we're all on our own, and we've got to take the future in our own hands.
Let me come in then with a final kind of point of discussion, because we're heading in this direction anyway, which is about stability, whether it be in post-war Europe or whether it be in the wider post-Napoleonic War world. I know Beatrice is particularly a guru in this area. Does the world become more or less politically stable? And I'm thinking here both about foreign policy, but also about domestic policy, this rise of revolutions, this rise of independence movements that we're starting to speak of. What are your thoughts? Beatrice, do you want to start us off here?
Yes, I really struggle with responding to that question. The subtitle of my book was How Europe Became Secure After 1815. I got a lot of criticism also of people saying it didn't become secure at all. Well, my point was, how did it become secure, and to what extent was it secure? What kind of security? Then for the elites, it was very secure. And for the mercantilist companies, it was secure as well. For the people with the new biens nationaux, it became very secure. It didn't become secure for the minorities, for the people that were bereft of their national territories, for the rebels. So it was a very ambivalent, Janus-faced kind of security was created. Yes, it was a kind of security in being the absence of great wars that did last a couple of decades. But if I may go back and respond to this question in connection with colonialism, imperialism, I think that's also for research a very important angle to probe deeper into, because also in historiography, you have the people studying Napoleon, people studying foreign policy in Europe, and people studying colonialism, imperialism, and it really isn't pretty much tied together. And I think you should make the case that after 1815, this all came together, domestic, the foreign, the colonialist, imperialist, in the sense that Europe was now tasked or enabled to go for the grand schemes. Well, Napoleon had showed how it could be done, and then the countries of Europe, they felt that they had to step in his footsteps. They were the ones who vanquished this great general. And for example, in the 1820s, 30s in Russia, there was this notion that what Alexander I had done, Nicholas should do as well. And that's where the Russians unleashed great campaigns of internal colonization, imperialism, in the direction of Kazakhstan or the Stan republics. They were colonized because the Russians felt it was now their duty to do so. If you take the UK, in the 20s and the 30s, there was more jingoism, even turning to the point that Lord Palmerston launched the first Afghan war, also against Russia to a certain extent. And Wellington himself, I twittered about this, Wellington himself thought this extremely stupid. He says, this won't work, this won't wash. It will be a perennial march against Afghanistan. And he didn't see where this imperialism came from, because his generation had been reluctant, a reluctant empire, constrained in fighting those wars. After that came the generals, the politicians who felt mobilized or even goaded by their populists. And you were pointing to nationalism, Charles. It was the liberal new elites. It was the people that climbed the barricades in Europe, vying for more liberty and freedom. Those were also the people, the bourgeoisie, the liberal elite, who invested in grand railways and steamships, in new imperialist affairs elsewhere. So the liberalism, the grand engineering schemes that came after Napoleon were liberal and led to more imperialism. So that Europe worked together meant that there was more imperialist mayhem outside of Europe. So did the world become more stable? In that sense, it didn't.
Alex, let me bring you straight in.
Yeah, I agree with her. And Beatrice has written eloquently on this subject. And it is a moment when, again, it shows you the complexity of history, that history should not be looked upon in simple terms. And it's always full of nuance. It's always full of undercurrents and diversity. So even within Europe, we oftentimes, hear that the end of Napoleonic Wars and the Vienna settlement brought about 3 decades of stability and peace. But we know that that is also not entirely true. So we don't have an all-out wars, but we have plenty of instability and certainly apprehension and concern, as Beatrice has shown in her own research. And of course, looking outside Europe, you see that if anything, the Napoleonic legacy, not of Napoleon, but of the period, the legacy is of continued instability, infighting, turmoil, misery, and war. Charles already broached the subject of the post-Napoleonic events in Spanish realm in the Western Hemisphere. I mean, for a decade, and I'm being very generous, a decade, the immediate decade, being of nothing but continued violence and real misery. The same can be said of other parts of the world, especially in the Middle East, and European efforts, which were, as Beatrice mentioned a minute ago, done under the aegis of the liberalism, under the aegis of development and growth, were imperial, that bred further instability. I mean, the second half of the 19th century can be hardly described as stable, whether in Europe or outside of it. So it is a complex subject, but I think well worth, that complexity in itself is very rewarding to contemplate. It gives you a lot of things to ponder on what it is that humans, the complexity of this human experience, how, even given the opportunity to settle things, we are oftentimes, we oftentimes rise to the occasion.
And Charles, the final word from you.
Yeah, the legacy of Napoleon is very quickly confronted by, and indeed overshadowed by, a development which was already in train at the time of his rule, but which is only just getting going and doesn't really grip the whole of Europe in its tentacles, if you like, until about 1870, when its effects finally reach out to almost everywhere because of the development of the railway system. What I'm talking about, of course, is the Industrial Revolution. Yes, I certainly believe that the Napoleonic era left Europe and indeed the world in a pretty unstable state. At the same time, I feel that the Napoleonic system was very, very ill-equipped to deal with the impact of the Industrial Revolution. And the impact of the Industrial Revolution was, of course, very complex. You can come up with different narratives. You can come up with one narrative which says that, which tells us that absolutely every artifact we can see, behind our mugshots in this Zoom thing, everything that we see, the very clothes that we wear, the glasses that I've got on, that Jack's got on, they're all products of the Industrial Revolution. The medical care we enjoy, what's got us through COVID, all the rest of it, and there's a very, very positive message. It's also, of course, a message about female emancipation. It's about Beatrice being able to become the distinguished professor which she so deserves to be. They're a very positive message. The trouble is that running in parallel to that, and this was the aspect which I tended to stress in my teaching, is that you have a very, very dark story where instability, fear, confusion, chaos breeds ever increasing levels of hatred, where nationalism becomes ever more hateful, where racism becomes ever more acute. And what you have is a very, very nasty, dark, and horrific story, which leads us straight from the Industrial Revolution gripping Europe, its hands around its throat in 1870, straight to the horrors of the First World War. And then still worse, from the First World War straight to the horrors of the Holocaust. And that was the narrative of my European survey at Liverpool. It was really the origins of the Holocaust, which is the greatest question which has to be dealt with by any historian.
It's a somber note to end on, but it is one that reflects the seriousness that has underpinned this discussion. And I know we could talk for another 2 hours on this topic, but I'm conscious that you've got interviews lined up literally within minutes of ending this. So we are, I'm very sorry to say, going to have to call a halt on this one. I want to thank all of you ever so much for your input this evening. It has been a fascinating discussion, a nuanced discussion, one that's gone in so many different ways, but has been vibrant and has been a demonstration of how you can, and folks of Twitter, take note, please, and also of Facebook, you can disagree about Napoleon and his legacy and still be pleasant about it, as I'm forever chastising people. I do, before you go though, want to plug your work and also encourage people to follow you on social media. So Beatrice, is your Twitter handle at Beatrice de Graaf? Is it as simple as that? Okay, Beatrice is nodding in confirmation, fantastic. And Beatrice, as I've said already, but I make no apologies for saying again, wrote Fighting Terror After Napoleon, How Europe Became Secure After 1815. And it is well worth getting a hold of a copy. Alex, I'm trying to remember yours off the top of my head. I just know that I can type Alex Mikaberidze into Twitter and find you very easily.
It's at a Mikaberidze, so as long as you can spell my last name, you'll find me.
Fantastic. And Alex wrote, amongst a whole host of works, on the Russian perspective of the Napoleonic Wars, which is an area that we do need to have a discussion about at some point, hopefully in the not too distant future. Alex wrote, The Napoleonic Wars, a Global History, which has been very, very highly regarded by those who've read and reviewed it. So folks, go and investigate that. And Charles, I believe yours is as simple as @Charles Esdaile, your Twitter.
Yes, I see no reason to be ashamed of my name.
Absolutely. And Charles's works, amongst a whole host of others, include Napoleon's Wars, which, the name won't surprise you given his stance on Napoleon. It's all down to Napoleon. It's all Napoleon's fault. And the Peninsular War, A New History. Alex, Charles, Beatrice, thank you ever so much for joining me.
Absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
I want to thank Zach for the opportunity, and Charles and Beatrice, wonderful discussion. I do appreciate it.
Before you go, just a quick one from me. Remember to like and subscribe. That makes a massive difference in terms of the algorithms that help to spread the word on the Napoleonicist. If you are keen, then you can also leave a review. Preferably a really nice one would be good, but be honest. And also remember to share with your friends. If somebody else who you know is going to be interested in the content, then please do pass the word along the line. It all helps. As ever, if you are interested in supporting the podcast financially, check out the links in the description. There are a host of options, so from one-off tips to becoming a regular supporter, with perks in the supporters field on Patreon for the different tiers of membership. If you just want to leave a one-off tip though, then go to the Ko-fi link, and as ever, I'm sure you know already because I bang on about it enough, that your generosity is massively appreciated, whatever the size of your support. As ever, a huge shout out to my Patreon supporters who keep the podcast going through their subscriptions. They do get, nice little perks like discounts at publishers, and they even have their own Discord server now where they're chatting away even as I record this. But a particular thanks to my Emperor level patrons, Mark Stoos and JC Kaiser, my Commander patrons, Gerb Brown, Jane Davis, Marcus Cribb and Bob Burnham, and my mentioned in Dispatches patrons, Jeff Maple, Mark Dewhurst, Jim Getz, Stephen Colson, Colin Fieldhouse, Ryan Diamond, Alexandra Leon, Josh Keeney, Gareth Copeland, Ross Flowers, Jim Deary, Lucy Tatner, James Bevan, Rory Muir, Lynn Dawson, Beatrice de Graaf, Anna Vakulenko, John Haynes, Brendan Teeling, an anonymous Canadian, Alex Churchill, and Rob Griffith. Join me in a fortnight when I will be talking to you about a rather important project, a charity that I've been setting up off the back of the Bones of Burgos, and you'll actually hear somebody slightly different in the presenter's hot seat for that episode, because I can't exactly interview myself. That would be a little bit embarrassing. Until then, I'm Zach White. This has been The Napoleonicist. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Stay well, stay safe, and as always, thank you for listening.
Thank you.